You have probably taken the test. Myers-Briggs. 16 personalities. Some quiz online that asked whether you prefer parties or quiet evenings, and told you whether you are an introvert or an extrovert, and you accepted the label introvert, extrovert, ambivert. You use it to explain yourself, to excuse yourself, to understand yourself. But here is what almost nobody tells you. The person who invented these terms, Carl Jung, would barely recognize how they are being used today. What Jung actually meant by introversion and extroversion is so much more precise, so much more psychologically rich, and so much more useful than anything a personality quiz has ever captured, that understanding it will permanently change how you see yourself and the people around you. This is not about whether you recharge alone or in groups. This is about the fundamental orientation of your entire psyche, where your energy flows, what you trust, how you make meaning, what you fear, and why. Once you understand the real distinction, everything about your inner life will suddenly make more sense. Part 1. Where the terms actually came from. 2 to 8. Jung introduced the concepts of introversion and extroversion in 1921 in one of his most important and least read books, Psychological Types. It was not a pop psychology book. It was a dense, rigorous 600-page examination of the fundamental differences in psychological orientation that Jung had observed across decades of clinical practice and across centuries of philosophy, theology, and literature. Jung noticed something that kept appearing in his work with patience. Two fundamentally different ways of relating to the world. Two fundamentally different orientations of the psyche, not better or worse, not healthy or unhealthy, simply different, in the most basic way possible, different in the direction the psyche naturally flows. The extrovert, in Jung's original formulation, is a person whose psychic energy flows primarily outward, toward the object, toward the external world, toward people, events, circumstances, the concrete reality of what is happening outside. The introvert is a person whose psychic energy flows primarily inward, toward the subject, toward the internal world, toward ideas, impressions, inner states, the subjective experience of what is happening inside. This is not about shyness. This is not about social anxiety. This is not about whether you enjoy being around people. Jung was describing something far more fundamental, the direction in which the psyche naturally orients when it is trying to understand reality. The extrovert looks outward first, to the external world, to understand what is true. The introvert looks inward first, to the inner world, to understand what is true. Both are valid orientations. Both have extraordinary strengths. Both have specific vulnerabilities. And the confusion between Jung's original formulation and the pop psychology version has produced an enormous amount of misunderstanding, both of other people and of oneself. Part 2. What Jung actually said about each type, 8 to 15. Let us be precise about what Jung observed. The extrovert in Jung's framework has a fundamentally positive relationship with the external world. Objects, people, things, events, circumstances have a magnetic quality for the extrovert. They draw the psychic energy outward. They energize. They orient. The extrovert trusts the external world. They are comfortable adapting to it, engaging with it, being shaped by it. Their sense of reality is grounded in what is happening outside. When an extrovert is uncertain, when they need to understand something, they move outward. They talk, they engage. They test ideas against the reactions of others. They find clarity through external interaction. The danger of the extrovert, the specific vulnerability that Jung identified, is what he called loss of self in the object. The extrovert can become so oriented toward the external world, so responsive to others, so shaped by what is happening outside, that the inner world becomes neglected. The genuine inner life, the authentic desires, the personal values, the subjective truth that is not dependent on external validation, can become thin and inaccessible. The extrovert who never develops the inner life becomes reactive, driven by external circumstances rather than internal conviction, emptied out by the constant outward flow of energy. The introvert is the mirror image. For the introvert, the inner world has the magnetic quality. Ideas, impressions, inner states. These draw the psychic energy inward. They energize, they orient. The introvert trusts the inner world. Their sense of reality is grounded in what is happening inside. When an introvert is uncertain, they move inward. They reflect, they withdraw, they process internally. They find clarity through inner engagement rather than outer interaction. Jung wrote in Psychological Types that the introvert is always fighting a tendency to withdraw from objects, to prefer the inner image to the outer reality. The danger of the introvert, the specific vulnerability, is what Jung called loss of relationship to the external world. The introvert can become so oriented toward the inner world, so absorbed in ideas and impressions and subjective states, that the external world becomes threatening or simply unreal. The genuine relationship to reality, to other people, to events, to the concrete circumstances of actual life, can become strained and difficult. The introvert who never develops the relationship to the external world becomes isolated, cut off, living in a rich inner world that has no bridge to the outer one. Part 3. The 8 types nobody talks about, 1500 to 2200. Here is where it gets genuinely interesting. And here is where almost every popular discussion of introversion and extroversion completely falls short. Jung did not stop at 2 types. He identified 8, because he understood that introversion and extroversion are not the whole story. They are the fundamental orientation, the direction the psychic energy flows. But that energy is expressed through 4 specific psychological functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition. And each of these functions can be oriented either extroverted or introverted, in producing 8 distinct psychological types, each with its own specific way of relating to reality, processing information, making decisions, and engaging with the world. The extroverted thinking type, oriented toward objective facts, external logic, practical systems. At their best, organized, systematic, effective. At their worst, rigid, dismissive of subjective experience, unable to value what cannot be measured. The introverted thinking type, oriented toward inner logic, theoretical frameworks, the internal architecture of ideas. At their best, profound, original, capable of insights that pure observation could never produce. At their worst, disconnected from practical reality, incomprehensible to others, living in conceptual worlds that have no bridge to the concrete. The extroverted feeling type, oriented toward harmony, relationship, the emotional atmosphere of the group. At their best, warm, socially intelligent, capable of creating genuine connection. At their worst, unable to maintain positions that create conflict, losing the authentic self in the service of social harmony. The introverted feeling type, oriented toward intense inner values, deep personal meaning, the authentic emotional response beneath the social surface. At their best, possessed of extraordinary depth and genuineness. At their worst, invisible to others, unable to communicate the richness of the inner world, withdrawn behind a surface that gives nothing away. The extroverted sensation type, oriented toward concrete external reality, the facts of immediate experience, the physical world as it actually presents itself. At their best, grounded, practical, fully present to what is actually happening. At their worst, unable to move beyond the surface of experience, missing the meaning beneath the facts. The introverted sensation type, oriented toward the subjective inner impression that external reality produces, the inner response, the aesthetic sense, the personal resonance. At their best, possessed of a rich and subtle inner life, exquisitely attuned to personal experience. At their worst, opaque, living in a subjective world that others cannot access. The extroverted intuitive type, oriented toward possibilities in the external world, the potential of situations and people, what could be rather than what is. At their best, visionary, generative, able to see connections and opportunities that others miss. At their worst, constantly abandoning what they have started in pursuit of the next possibility, unable to commit to the present. The introverted intuitive type, oriented toward the inner images and symbolic meanings that arise from the unconscious, the patterns beneath the surface of experience, the mythological and archetypal dimensions of reality. At their best, prophetic, deeply original, in contact with dimensions of experience that are invisible to the more practically oriented types. At their worst, incomprehensible, lost in inner visions that have no connection to the world others inhabit. Jung believed that every person has a dominant function, the one that is most developed and most naturally expressed, and an inferior function, its opposite, the one that is least developed, most unconscious, and most likely to produce difficulty. The thinking type's inferior function is feeling. The feeling type's inferior function is thinking. The sensation type's inferior function is intuition. But the intuition type's inferior function is sensation, and the inferior function, the least developed, most unconscious aspect of the psyche, is precisely where the shadow tends to accumulate. Part 4. The inferior function and the shadow. 22 minutes to 28 minutes. This is the part that connects Jung's theory of psychological types to his broader understanding of the psyche. And it is the part that most discussions of introversion and extraversion completely miss. Jung believed that the inferior function, the opposite of the dominant, is the gateway to the unconscious, the place where the shadow lives, the source of the most significant difficulties and the most significant potential in any person's psychological life. For the thinking type, who has developed the capacity for logical, objective analysis to a high degree, feeling is the inferior function, not emotion in the simple sense, but the capacity for genuine value-based judgment. The ability to relate to people as full human beings rather than as problems to be analyzed. The capacity for authentic connection that does not require rational justification. This capacity, underdeveloped in the thinking type, tends to express itself in the shadow. It emerges in distorted forms, as unexpected emotional outbursts from someone who is usually composed and rational, as irrational attachments that the conscious mind cannot account for, as a sentimentality that seems completely at odds with the analytical personality. For the feeling type, thinking is the inferior function, the capacity for objective analysis, logical consistency, principled judgment that is not distorted by emotional preference. This capacity, underdeveloped in the feeling type, also tends to express itself in the shadow as unexpected rigidity, as a harsh, critical inner voice that the warm and accommodating persona conceals, as a tendency to be manipulated by others' logic, precisely because the feeling type's own thinking function is not well developed. Jung wrote in Psychological Types that the inferior function is always associated with an archaic quality. It operates at a more primitive, less differentiated level than the dominant function. And this archaic quality is both the source of its difficulty and the source of its potential. Because the inferior function, precisely because it is connected to the unconscious, carries access to depths of experience that the dominant function cannot reach. The thinking type, who finally engages their feeling function, who finally allows genuine value and meaning and authentic human connection to become real, often experiences this as one of the most significant transformations of their life. The feeling type who finally develops their thinking function, who finally achieves the capacity for principled, consistent, non-reactive judgment, often finds a groundedness and authority they could not access before. This is what Jung meant by individuation in the context of psychological types. Not the elimination of the dominant function, the development of the inferior function, the gradual integration of the whole range of psychological capacities, not just the ones that came naturally. Part 5. Why this actually matters. 28 minutes to 34 minutes. This is not abstract. This is not theoretical. This has direct and specific implications for how you understand yourself and how you understand the people around you. The conflicts that feel most irresolvable between people who seem to be speaking completely different languages are often conflicts between different psychological types. The thinking type and the feeling type in a relationship. The sensation type and the intuitive type working together. The extrovert and the introvert trying to understand each other's basic orientation to reality. These are not conflicts of values. They are conflicts of perception. Different types are genuinely perceiving reality differently, not distorting it, not being irrational, genuinely perceiving different aspects of the same reality through the lens of their dominant function. The extrovert is not wrong when they say the introvert needs to engage more with the world. The introvert is not wrong when they say the extrovert needs to develop more inner depth. Both are seeing something real. Both are looking at the other person's inferior function, the undeveloped area, and identifying it accurately. The problem is assuming that the other person's inferior function is a flaw rather than an area of potential development. Jung's framework invites something more sophisticated, the recognition that every type has genuine strengths and genuine blind spots, that the qualities you most admire in others are often the qualities your own dominant function cannot easily produce, that the qualities that most irritate you in others are often the qualities your own inferior function is struggling to develop, and that genuine psychological maturity, individuation, involves not just becoming more fully what you naturally are, but gradually developing what does not come naturally. Part 6. The modern distortion, 34 minutes to 38 minutes, 30 seconds. It is worth being direct about how far the modern use of these concepts has drifted from what Jung actually meant. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, the most widely used personality assessment in the world, was developed by Isabel Briggs Myers and her mother, Catherine Cook Briggs, neither of whom was a trained psychologist. They based it on Jung's psychological types, but in the translation, something essential was lost: the binary quality. You are either an introvert or an extrovert. either a thinker or a feeler, either a sensor or an intuitive. Jung never said this. Jung was explicit in Psychological Types that every person uses all four functions. The question is, which one is dominant? Which one is most developed? Which one the person naturally reaches for first? Not which one they use exclusively. The binary framing, introvert or extrovert, with a clear line between them, produces a rigidity that Jung's actual framework does not contain. It invites people to identify with a type, to use it as an explanation, as an excuse, as a fixed identity, in ways that are precisely the opposite of what Jung intended. Jung was not trying to put people in boxes. He was trying to give people a map, a way of understanding their own natural orientation, so they could work with it, develop beyond it, and ultimately transcend the limitations of any single type. The goal of individuation, in the context of psychological types, is not to become a better introvert or a better extrovert. It is to become a more complete human being, one who has access to all four functions, one who can think clearly and feel authentically and perceive concretely and intuit the pattern beneath the surface, one who can orient outward when the situation requires it and inward when the situation requires that. Not because they have eliminated their natural type, but because they have developed what the natural type left underdeveloped. Close. 3830 to 40. Jung spent his career insisting in one thing above almost everything else: that human beings are more complex than any category can contain, that the richest and most interesting aspects of any person are precisely the ones that do not fit neatly into any box. The introvert label, however useful as a starting point, is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of understanding your natural orientation, your dominant function, your inferior function, the specific areas of development that your type has left underdeveloped, and the specific potential that lives, often quietly, often uncomfortably, in the parts of your psyche that your dominant function cannot easily access. You are not simply an introvert or an extrovert. You are a specific configuration of psychological capacities, some highly developed, some waiting to be developed, with a unique relationship to both the inner and outer world. And understanding that specific configuration with the precision and honesty that Jung's actual framework makes possible is one of the most useful things you can do for your own psychological development. Not to label yourself, to understand yourself genuinely, specifically, in the full complexity that you actually are. Subscribe to Carl Jung Psychology and drop a comment below. Which type resonates with you? And more interestingly, which function do you think is your inferior one? The answer to that second question tells you more about your psychological development than any personality test ever could.